welcome to another installment of Janus Academy's Historical Analogy course. This is the 11th lecture in our ongoing series. This lecture is going to be about the relation that we have between Gothic Revival style and Dada. Now this is a tricky one because we're not talking really about stylistical analogies, about stylistical similarities when it comes to Gothic Revival style and Dada, because if we're talking about Dada, we're not really talking about style. It's not a stylistical formation. It's more of a school of thought. It's more a philosophical or anti-philosophical, if you will, movement than anything else. Now, on the other end, if we're talking about Gothic Revival, we are more precisely speaking talking about the general return to medieval thought and all things medieval. So not about the particular aesthetics that aims to emulate Gothic aesthetics, only in the context of the 18th or the 19th, in this case, early 20th century. But we're talking about, more broadly speaking, medieval thought and medieval worldview, which is even more important. So we need to place this thing right, and we need to start by talking about the general context. So we know that Dada style is created during the beginning years of World War I, that it is very anti-war, it is decidedly anti-war, but it is not just a pacifistic movement or a pacifist movement. It really is a movement that aims to be against war and everything that led to war. So it's very anti-societal. People who tend to be more conservative in their thought, people who are right-wing thinkers or right-wing art historians, like to state that Dada was all about nihilism, that it was a nihilistic philosophy and a nihilistic approach to art. And this is not true. This is simply not accurate. You could argue that Dada was against one particular vision of society. It wasn't against society as such. It was against all of the things that right-wing, conservative, pro-capitalistic, pro-nationalistic thinkers are for. So you could argue that Dada was not against the world, it was against this particular vision of the world, because Dada was decidedly left-wing, it was anti-war, it was also anti-state, anti-institutions, etc. So if you want to exhaust your entire world in existence of one type of institutions, you can say that Dada was nihilistic, but it wasn't really, broadly speaking, that way. Again, it was just against one particular vision of the world, not against the world as such. Now, on the other end, we have this whole idea of medieval revival, Gothic revival, bringing back of the medieval thought, and this is done in a very peculiar manner. And I would argue that this is done in a manner that has more to do with Orthodox Christianity than it does with Catholic Christianity or Protestant. Indeed, you could argue that Dada, fundamentally speaking, is this turn towards orthodoxy or towards basic principles of orthodoxy and a reaction against Catholicism and Protestantism, or rather the society that these two religions came out of, that society that produced these two religions, or if you want to turn the thing the other way around, societies that grew out of these two religions. We're not going to get into discussion of which came first, the chicken or the egg, in this particular topic. So it's this idea that Dada is a complete refusal of the world, and this is exactly why we compare it to the medieval period, because to a large extent, the medieval period, generally speaking, is and can be seen as such, is the refusal of this world over the next. So we claim in the medieval period, and this is of course a very broad statement that can be attacked from many different positions, I am well aware of this, but generally speaking we can say that medieval period, in terms of its philosophy, in terms of its art, in terms of its general worldview, is more interested in what is eternal than it is in what is temporal. So it means that medieval period exhausts itself into contemplation of eternity, eternal truths and beauties, and it's more about the soul than it is about the body. So you could say that we have this very basic premise that body is temporal, it's corruptible, soul is eternal, it's in this particular way much closer to the notion of perfection than the body is. So we could say that it's a very medieval thing to be thinking about the soul, to be thinking about eternity, rather than earthly affairs that are temporal by their very definition. Now, if we're talking about this whole thing, we need to then understand what we started from, this idea that Dada was not just anti-war, it was against society that produced the war. It was against the causes or root causes of these particular events that shaped the beginning of World War I and the beginning of the 20th century. Really, if you're talking about Western Europe or generally Europe, you could argue that World War I was something that was profoundly formative and profoundly destructive for the entirety of society, for the entirety of culture, and indeed civilization. So if we're talking about these things, we're talking about Dadaists being interested in opposing all of the causes, all of the root causes of World War I, and generally the entire society that produced it. So we could argue that there's another important connection to be made between these things that we are talking about, and it really is the fact that we claim that Dadaism is very close to medieval period in one particular aspect, and as such that it is very close to religion, Christianity to be more precise. And again, I argue rather Orthodox than Catholic or Protestant. Now, this would be denied by most of the Dadaists themselves, because most of Dadaists were radically left people. They did not care about religion. This was yet another institution they were against. They were very much against the institution of the church. They saw it as yet another oppressive, totalitarian, etc. institution that had its own role in this entire apocalyptic calamity that they were going through. We are talking about World War I, of course. So if you were to question Dadaists, famous people that shaped the movement, like let's say Tristan Tzara or Marcel Duchamp, they would probably tell you that they were very much anti-religion, that religion was one of the roots of the problem, that it was really what brought about this decadent failure of a society that produced World War I. Yet, from our point of view, when we are analyzing this, we say that they are religious, and even deeply so. Now, how does this work? Well, it really goes back to the idea of what Christianity is all about. Fundamentally speaking, it goes to this difference between a figure of Christ and Christianity. So there's a rather well-known anecdote that Karl Marx said that he is not a Marxist. He is very much against the idea of Marxism. And he said this while he was still alive, of course. So there is this big difference between, conversely, between a figure of Christ and what he stood for, what was his mission, and then on the other end, the institution of the church. Any Christian church will extend the olive branch here. So there is this great difference, considerable difference between the idea on one end and realization of that idea on the other. And not funny, but a very poignant point to be made here is that even in the Bible, even in the New Testament, in the Gospels that are sharing the story of Christ, Christ is already against institutions. He is already against organized religion, which again you can see as ironic to a certain extent. But we know for a fact that Christ kicked the merchants out of the temple, so he was very much against the practice of Judaism as it happened in that particular moment. He was very much against corruption inside the institution, and he famously also said to St. Peter that on one end, St. Peter is going to be the foundational stone, Peter means the stone, by the way, of this new church that he is about to make, but on the other end, he is going to betray Christ while Christ is still alive. So these are very famous passages. So it's like this idea that Christ is aware of founding the church, of starting something new, something important, something that is indeed revolutionary, but he's aware of the corruption that is going to be installed pretty much from the very beginning. So this is a bit of a oxymoronical situation. This is very absurd, and it really is very adequate for this type of conversation because Dada deals with the absurd, it deals with oxymorons, it deals with all sorts of lapses and failures of logic. Now, what I want to argue here is that Dadaism is originally Christian, profoundly Christian in this regard, because it's all about the refusal of the world as it is. It's not, again, the refusal of the world in general, it's the refusal of the fallen state of world. It's a refusal of the world that is decadent, that is corrupt, violent, and that has produced this impossibly disastrous affair that is World War I. Now again, we need to understand that we see World War I as with different eyes, given historical distance that we have, than people who partook in this war, than people that were alive while it was still happening. There was a very long period. When I say very long, I say a couple of years, but this can really be eternity in one's subjective perception. There was then very long period of World War I when it just seemed that it was never going to end. This is just the world we live in right now. And the world we live in right now, or the world that we lived in back in the day, was the one where we send all of the resources, all of the money, all of the products, all of the industry is engaged in producing weapons, in producing ammunition. We send huge amounts of young people to the fronts where they meet gruesome deaths. And this all just seemed to have been the new status quo, the new normal. So this impression lasted arguably anywhere between 1914 to 1917. It was only in the 1917 that we had a bit of a breaking point and that we started saying, okay, this thing may actually sometimes end. But in between, there was this very long period, again, 2 or 3 years, where we just saw no end, no possible end. It was the so-called stationary position warfare, where it was all about the trenches, and the Western front line did not move almost at all. I think the totality of movement of the front line in the Western Front was 4 kilometers, something like that. So yeah, this seemed to be the new normal, and these people were protesting this new normal. They said that the world that found itself in this position was the world of absurd. It was the world of nonsense. It was the world that failed all logic. And it was really this idea of reason, the idea of logic, the idea of structure and of philosophy and all these things that has led us to its apparent opposite. So these people argued that it was really the logic of this world, which for them was capitalistic, colonial, logic of reason, logic of numbers, logic of, let's say, this particular form of abstractions, was exactly something that led us into this absurd destruction that had no point, that had no sense, and that seemingly had no end. So you could say that Dadaists made a logical connection between the heritage of Enlightenment and between a Cartesian school of thought, which was all about reason, which was all about, again, logic, and this particular approach to the world. They saw this uninterrupted connection, cultural and philosophical continuity, if you will, between Descartes on one end, Voltaire on the other, and then whatever was going on in the world in the midst of World War I. So this is one of the reasons why the pivotal institution, I know that it's a very poor choice of words, but what can we do? One of the most important physical sites, if you will, not to say institutions, for the Dada movement was Cabaret Voltaire. Now, we know that cabarets are places of entertainment that is not necessarily seen as very artistically demanding or very artistically pretentious, so it's light entertainment. A lot of it deals with stand-up comedy, sometimes a bit of striptease, sometimes a bit of singing, dancing. So the point is that cabarets are not seen as haughty, pretentious art forms like, let's say, ballet or tragic theater or something down those lines. No, it's light entertainment. And then the other part of this word is Voltaire, which, as we know, is one of the head figures, if not the head figure, of the Enlightenment movement. So they're bringing these two together. They're saying that on one end we have cheap kind of light entertainment that often ventures into the burlesque, into parody, into comedy. And then on the other, we have this monumental figure that is of incredible importance, not just for French culture, but indeed European culture. So they're saying Voltaire really is one of the root causes of this incredibly violent, absurd, and downright wrong situation in which we find ourselves in. And so what they want to do is then they want to refuse all of this. They want to refuse this kind of world. And you could argue that this is really the connection that we're making with medieval Christianity. We are making this connection that you want to refuse the world, you want to refuse logic of this world. Now, if we are to go back to, let's say, the early medieval period, but then even the late medieval period, it's not terribly different in this particular regard. We are truly talking about the refusal of this world and our entire investment into the netherworld, into the world that comes after this. So we want to dedicate ourselves to contemplation of eternity. Now, this is why I'm saying that the entire Dadaist initiative is more orthodox than anything else. It's far more orthodox than it is Catholic. And the reason why I'm saying this is because orthodoxy practices a form of mysticism that relies on your feelings and your emotions, truly on your soulful perception of God, than it does on reason. Reason is more of a Catholic and then Protestant affair. So you could say that if you're a medieval Catholic, you want to cognate God. You want to think your way through to God. And this is very much connected to the whole Aristotelian influence on the medieval period, to great philosophers. Some would argue the greatest philosopher that ever lived, St. Thomas Aquinas, and his take on Aristotelian philosophy. So it's this whole idea that you explain existence of God. So if you want to read any of the massive volumes of writings that St. Thomas Aquinas has produced, you see that he has this impeccable logic through which he explains existence of God and purpose of God, the nature of Christ, and all of these things. On the other end, we have the Orthodox take on things that you don't really have to contemplate God. You don't have to create a perfect mental mechanism, this incredibly rigorous scholastic philosophical discipline through which you understand God, which is kind of a contradiction. You can never truly understand God, but you can keep trying. So you don't do any of those things. You just feel God. You open your heart to God. So you accept God through your heart. And this is a completely different affair. This is an affair that not only claims that logic is useless in this particular endeavor, indeed it is harmful, because it argues in its more extreme versions that logic and rational mind are really the works of the Satan. So it has a lot more to do with pagan worldview than it does with Christian worldview. And this is something that you can see is the logic of Heraclitus on one end, pagan logic, which is very much all about reason and cognition and that type of intellectual practice. And on the other end, you have not to say philosophy, but rather approach of St. John the Baptist. So it's either logos of St. John the Baptist or it is logos of Heraclitus. So either Christian, and by this I mean early Christian that later becomes Orthodox Christian, or pagan logic that is then later integrated into Catholicism through Aristotle, through St. Thomas Aquinas, and that entire line of thought that results in Descartes, and then that results in this particular situation that we find ourselves in at the beginning of the 20th century. So what the Dadaists are trying to do is that they're trying to reject this type of world. They're trying to reject this type of logic, this type of structure, and everything that grows out of it. So this is a very ambitious initiative, you might argue. And it really has a lot to do with how you see fundaments of Christianity. Now, if you're to talk about Jesus Christ on one end and then Karl Marx on the other, and I'm bringing these two figures up because Dada was a very left-oriented, very left-wing movement, radically left-wing, you could say. We are talking about the worldview that is very, very anti-totalitarian, that is very anti-statist, and very anti-institutional. So you could say that if you look at the teachings and work and philosophy of Karl Marx, you could say that profoundly in its essence, Marx was a liberal. He grows out of school of liberalism, and he is all about human freedom. He is all about the freedom of individual. He is all about the accomplishment of human capacity, of the capacity of the individual. He believes that freedom is only achieved if we are free of private property. Now, we are not to make a mistake and conflate private and personal property. When we say private property, we're talking about things that generate profit. So we're talking about patents or factories or banks or land. So this idea that you own property that can turn profit. On the other end, you have personal property, things that don't turn profit, things like a shirt that you're wearing, the house that you live in, the car that you're driving. So these are the things that you just use and that are of personal use to you, but you don't weaponize them, you don't instrumentalize them in order to create profit. So the whole idea of Marx is that he is profoundly anti-statist, that he argues that when we reach communism during the long march of history, we will find ourselves in a situation where we no longer need standing armies, where we no longer need the state, we don't need the tools of oppression of the state. We will basically surpass the necessity for all these things because we will no longer have private property. And with property out of the way, we no longer have any reason to really attack one another. We don't have any reason to engage into warfare. If you think about it, and this is a fairly obvious conclusion, people go to war because they want what they don't have. They want to take what their neighbor has. And this is really, you can boil down pretty much any warfare that ever happened to this reason. You want something that other people have. And of course, we can label this differently. We can say that wars are waged for religion or for different system of values or for different takes on civilization. If you're just a little bit cynical, you can say that all of these have always been nonsense. Wars have always been waged for property. Now, we don't necessarily have to agree with any of this, but we need to say that this is what Dadaists felt themselves because they were very left-wing. So their whole idea was that they wanted to usher in a world that didn't follow all these rules of property, of this particular type of logic, etc., that necessarily result in warfare. So this is why Marx argued the so-called end of history, because the end of history begins when we no longer have any reason for conflict. And Marx was a dialectical materialist, which meant that he saw history as happening through conflict. So the conflict really was the substance of history. So once we find ourselves in a situation where we no longer have to have conflicts, we no longer have history happening, and we basically get to a stable, uninterrupted state. This is how he saw communism. And this is basically what Christ is arguing in his own right. So if you go back to teachings of Christ, you can say that Christ was a proto-communist. Now I'm saying a proto because you can't really have communism without the industrial process. These things are very closely connected. But Christ was a figure that preached against property. He said very famously that it was easier for a camel to go to the ear of a needle than it is for a rich person to get into the kingdom of heaven. And again, he kicked the merchants out of the temple. This was the greatest affront. This was the greatest blasphemy in the eyes of Christ himself. And we can give many, many different accounts that substantiate this particular position, that Christ was very, very staunchly and very definitively against wealth and against property as such. And you could say that attachment to property is really the attachment to matter, to the material world. And this again takes us back to the medieval period that was all about against this world. Now, when I say this particular world, this is what I'm referring to. Material world, something that is based in matter, something that is based in our impulse to possess matter. And you could argue, we'll get to this when we get to other courses that we need to do, that this capacity of owning things is a very recent situation. Now, why do I say recent? Well, because back in the day, before the Neolithic agricultural revolution happened, we did not have private property. We did not have the notion of ownership. The thing is that we were nomadic, we moved around, and before we invented the wheel, we couldn't really carry that much. So you could own, air quotes, what you were able to carry. And as you know, you cannot really carry all that much. So we didn't really have this whole idea of owning things. The notion of ownership only becomes possible when we become sedentary, when we start building villages and cities, and when we start accumulating surplus of our production. So we did not know the concept of ownership, let's say, before 10,000 years. And we have established in some of the other courses that I have recorded but still haven't published, that if we are to talk about humanity, we're talking about humanity, let's say, existing in the most strictest, most conservative of terms in the previous 100,000 years. So even if you take this very, very conservative notion of what humanity is, we're talking about the situation where we have the notion of property only 1/10 of duration of our entire existence as the human species. So this is not something that is deeply embedded in us. This is like a virus that has taken over the society, that has taken over humanity, and the virus that exists in its own right for its own purposes. So this is what Christ on one end and Marx on the other are arguing, that we need to rid ourselves of this virus, and that we need to rid ourselves of all of the evils that come out of this virus, and violence and greed and ultimately warfare is something that is a direct result of all of this. So this is all very pertinent to the Dadaist movement, because again, they were very much left-wing and they were very much anti the entire society. Now, there is another connection between Orthodox Christianity and, you might argue, Orthodox Middle Ages and the Dada movement, and that is the connection we have with a very, very important event that is taking place in the Orthodox part of the world. And this is, of course, the Bolshevik Revolution. So you could argue that the Dada movement is only months, maximum a year or two, separated from the great Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. Now, of course, we say that this revolution happened in 1917, but we had a failed revolution in 1906. This was very, very, how should I say, this was an accumulation of events that led to the revolution. So we can say that for all intents and purposes, Dada movement is contemporary to the Bolshevik Revolution. And truly, they share this incredibly important trait that they are against the world. Now again, I'm underlining this. They're not against the world per se. They're not for destruction of humanity or destruction of the world. They're just for destruction of this particular world that we found ourselves in. And you can say the same thing about the Bolshevik Revolution. These people were not trying to destroy the world. They were trying to save it. They were trying to make it better. So the whole idea is that they mounted a revolution that, as any other revolution, by definition, like the French, like the American, is a very bloody, very violent affair. And they had this understanding, the Bolsheviks as well as the Dadas, that they need to change everything. Now, this is a very important thing to understand. If you're mounting a revolution, you cannot just aim to change the political clique. You cannot just aim to change the regime or even the dominant ideology, the set of values and ideas that drives this particular clique and this particular take on government. No, you have to change everything. This is a very important thing. Everything has to go. And when I say everything, I'm talking about culture, worldview, how you run the state, how you run or educational institutions, how you run religion. Everything has to go. Now, I will give an example that comes from the French Revolution, but it is very pertinent for both the Bolshevik Revolution and the Dada movement. And the example tells us about profundity in which a revolution needs to situate itself. So a revolution, if it's to be successful, needs to be radical. The term radical comes from Latin terms radis, which means the root. So you have to uproot the entire old world. You have to make sure that everything goes, everything is removed, so that it doesn't grow back again. So if you want to uproot a plant, well, you have to take the root out. You have to be radical about it. So what the French revolutionaries have done was that they created the so-called Republican calendar, or the revolutionary calendar. You can Google this if you want on your own end. And the goal of this particular calendar was to start counting time from zero. So they stuck with this calendar for 12 years. And you can see physical traits of this still present in the city of Paris and all over France, is that you can go to certain monuments and you can see that they state that they were done in the year 4. So they're like, how? It's not that old. Obviously, it comes from the end of the 18th century. But it comes from this period where they decided not to count time from the birth of Christ, but to count the time from the French Revolution. And I find this to be quite interesting. So not only that they've started counting time from zero, they've also changed the names of months. So we didn't have a Latin appellation of months anymore. We had a completely new organization and structure of months. So you could say that Zola's famous novel Germinal was named after this particular impulse, after this initiative. So it's one of the revolutionary months that loosely corresponds with April. Now, the French revolutionaries went back to using the regular Christian calendar, but the initiative has stayed, and it showed just how serious you have to be when you are mounting a revolution. You have to change literally everything, and you cannot think of a more profound change than how you count time. Really, it's what they wanted to do with this is they wanted to say, amongst other things, that they refuse to count time from birth of Christ because church became a problem. Church became a part of this old corrupt world that they were trying to get rid of. So it's really, it shows you how far and how deep you need to go if you want your revolution to be a success. And we're not going to open a discussion if French Revolution was a success or not. That's a whole other topic. We want to go back to the Dadaist movement and how medieval it was in its inspiration. How it went out of its way to refuse any form of logic. Now, I want to compare this to another notion that is very medieval, and that was explained by a very famous Russian scholar, Mikhail Bakhtin, who studied the institution of the carnival. Carnival in the medieval period, which was this very curious affair that had its roots in the pre-medieval rituals, most notably Saturnalia in Rome, and which was this one part of the year where everything was inversed. And the entire society was placed on its head. Everything was upside down. So what was done in Saturnalia and what was done in the medieval carnival was this whole idea of the outburst of all of the suppressed and repressed and inhibited negative emotions that you had throughout the year. So let's say that throughout the year we had to follow a very strict hierarchy. We had to bow down to our socially superior people. So we had to respect the dukes and the bishops. But then in a couple of days or sometimes weeks of the carnival, we would basically turn the society around. So whoever was on top needed to be on the bottom. And this, of course, invokes the words of Christ, if you remember that he who wants to be the first should be the last. So we have this inversion that on surface doesn't really make a lot of sense if we are to stay in Heraclitean logos, if we are to stay with the logic of this world, that in this particular perspective is the root of all evil. But if we assume the Christian logic, if we assume, well, Christic rather than Christian logic, we go in this particular direction. So I will give a quote from Corinthians that states, "For the wisdom of this world is foolishness in God's sight. As it is written, he catches the wise in their craftiness." So this is Corinthians 3:19. And the whole idea is that if you truly want to know the truth, if you truly want to imitate Christ, if you want to be Christ-like, which arguably is to be the ambition of every Christian, or any ambitious Christian who wants to truly be that way, we have to imitate Christ, and we have to assume a different kind of logic. So this is what Dada was all about. It was about assuming a different kind of logic, not necessarily dropping all logic altogether. And the logic that we are to assume, that we are to be driven by, is this logic of refusal of the material world, the refusal of property, refusal of greed, refusal of all of those things that ultimately always end up in war. So this was also, of course, very much connected to the colonial spirit of this particular era. It's a fact that very great many historians agree upon, that colonies and colonial question was really the driving reason, the driving, again, logic behind World War I. That Germany was not, or the country we today call Germany, was not happy with colonial division of the world. They felt that they needed more colonies. They felt that it was unjust that they don't have more colonies. Now, I find this to be, again, tragically ironic. I was going to say funny, but it would really, there's nothing funny about colonialism in this or any other respect. If we think about dozens of millions of victims that left in its wake. But the Germans were very unhappy that the English and the French and the Spanish and the Portuguese and the Belgians had all these colonies that they drew all their resources from, and Germans did not. So they were very frustrated by this situation, and through a series of events, this frustration basically exploded into World War I. So you could say that, again, if we're talking about the colonial issue, it's not that Germans were unhappy that the French are exploiting the African people, and they wanted to liberate them. No, far from it. They wanted their share of the cake. They wanted to exploit their own people that had a lot of labor and a lot of natural resources to offer. So again, if we see this from the point of a Dadaist, if we see this from the point of the Dada movement, we understand that we have to refuse this logic of greed. We have to refuse this logic of capitalism, and we have to basically understand that this particular logic is very, very strongly connected to the society that was mercantile capitalistic. So you could say that this particular society produced Descartes. It also produced Voltaire later on. It produced Lemaitre. So these philosophers who argued for reason, for logic, they saw the connection between capitalistic mode of production, be it mercantile or industrial on one end, with warfare, destruction, violence, and all the other things. So they thought that these two things are inseparable, and they wanted to do away with it. Since Dada was an artistic movement, they wanted to enact this change in the domain of art. So you could say that what started happening with Tristan Tzara and then later Marcel Duchamp was performance first. So we had the beginning of Dadaism really be invested in performance a lot more than any other forms of art. And then gradually from performance it grew into other forms of art that were very clearly and very specifically anti-art. So it really helps us to understand the position of Marcel Duchamp. So we're going to be talking about a very famous work of art that he's done, the famous fountain. And we're going to be talking about the appellation that Marcel Duchamp gave to himself and broadly speaking to the entire movement. Now, we go back to this position of Tristan Tzara that he is so staunchly anti-institutions, so staunchly anti-logic, anti-reason, anti-all of these things that result in World War I, that he said that if you're a true Dadaist, you are against Dada. So you're against everything, including your own position. So you're always on the lookout for this tendency we have to fall into our own definitions, to fall into our own trap, again, of logic, of this necessity to categorize, to explain, to formulate, etc. So no, you have to be against everything, including yourself. Now, we go back to this most important work of art that Marcel Duchamp has made, and that I argue is very medieval in its essence. And it is medieval because it speaks about the refusal of the world, and indeed it speaks about refusal of art as such, as a concept. A refusal of art that is invested in the realm of the material. So Marcel Duchamp called himself an artist, and this is a kind of a clever pun that takes the term anarchist, so someone who is against hierarchy, someone who is against archy, which means to rule, which means to socially and vertically stratify. So anarchist is someone who is against verticality and this notion that some people should rule over some other people. So if you're anarchist, you're against hierarchy by definition. If you think about the term hierarchy, this is something that I think is important to mention here. We are thinking about two terms, hieros and arche. So this idea that hieros or hieros is the sacred. So it's this idea of the sacred verticality. Arche is to rule. So it's like this idea of order, rather, arche. It's also the root term of the word archetype. So the first, the primary, something that is original. So if you have sacred order, in a way, sacred primacy, you are talking about hierarchy. And anarchists are against this idea of primacy, against this idea of order, and the for all idea of verticality. So Marcel Duchamp made a very clever connection, a clever pun, between this notion of anarchist on one end and an artist on the other. So we can say that in this particular regard, it's very much a part of the zeitgeist that we are talking about the beginning of the 20th century, when anarchist movement was very, very present and a very politically active force. So we could say that the cause of World War I, that we're talking about this entire time, was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand that took place in Sarajevo, that was exacted by Gavrilo Princip, who was a young Serbian/Yugoslavian anarchist. So you could say that the entire World War I was brought about, or was, how should we put this? This was not necessarily the cause of the war, but it was a justification. It was a casus belli. So you could say that Europe was preparing itself for this war for years. All of the European powers were arming themselves very seriously, so they knew that war was imminent. But this one event was used as a cause. So it was explained as such. So the whole idea is that anarchism is present. It's something that is very much alive and very important in the minds of political life of the early 20th century. And so Marcel Duchamp uses this when he proclaims himself to be an artist. So he is an anarchist in the realm of art. He brings the two together. And he explains us that this is really the function of art. It's to be opposed to these ideas of hierarchy, these ideas of verticality, and again, all of these ideas that brought about World War I. These ideas of society as it was, bourgeois, capitalistic, etc., that result in what truly appeared as apocalypse to its contemporaries. So he basically goes on a crusade against art, against the world of art. And this is quite funny that today we consider Marcel Duchamp to be one of the leading voices of the 20th century, one of the most important and influential artists of the 20th century, the person who, in their own words, was very much against art, who was an artist. So what Marcel Duchamp is most famous for is the work of art that we nowadays know as the fountain. This is a ready-made, so this is not the work of art that he created. It is basically a urinal that he sent to a gallery and said, voila, this is art, this is what I stand behind. So this is a urinal that was signed with the false name Armat. So if we look at the urinal, we see the inscription Armat 1917. And this urinal was not created work. This is a very important thing. And this will become all the more important in the other course that we have, and this is the course of history of art. When we start talking about the Maniport, the very first work of art that, or how should I say this, the very first artifact, the very first object that we can, to a certain extent, one way or the other, consider to be artistic, to consider to be a work of art. So we're talking about this approach to art where you are not necessarily creating something, you are not working with your hands, you don't have the skill to create, you basically recognize a thing. And so this thing recognized is taken out of its context and is placed into a completely different context. So this is a urinal. And as you can imagine, a urinal, the likes of which you can find in a lot of public toilets, especially at that time, is not a very elegant object. It's not very beautiful. Actually, it's quite the opposite of that. So it's something that is very quotidian, very banal, and honestly associated with, how should I say, well, notion of dirtiness, the notion of filth even, because we assume that public urinals are a place, well, where a lot of people goes through and they're not always maintained in the perfect state of cleanliness. So the idea is that Marcel Duchamp was looking for the most banal, most offensive object that he sought to present as art. And so what he was trying to suggest by this is that there are no internal qualities to an object that would define it as artistic. So he was saying with this gesture, up until this moment, we had this idea that if you go to the Academy of Fine Arts, if you develop this amazing skill to be a painter or a sculptor or whichever other thing, you exert your skill and you create an object that is infused with unique individual capacities such as style, beauty, elegance, the notion of the sacred, also very important. And you consider this to be art. No, this is completely false. It has nothing to do with the object itself. So this is the revolutionary statement and the revolutionary influence this particular gesture has exerted. So he's saying none of these make sense. So it's not the skill of the artist that creates the work of art. It's not his or hers inspiration, creativity, divine enlightenment, insight, or what have you. None of these make any sense. The only thing that makes sense, the only thing that decides if an object is a work of art or not, is basically the reception of the community. So if a community, let's say in general, or made of art critics, gallerists, art historians, etc., If a community agrees that a certain object is a work of art, it is a work of art. And literally, this is the only thing that decides, the only thing that makes something either a piece of art or not. We shall have an entirely separate course that is going to be dedicated to the question of what is art. And there are many different ways to respond to this question. So what Marcel Duchamp is doing here is that he is responding that in his own manner. This is one of the ways to respond. Now, he also wanted to make a very important statement by applying a false signature, by signing it not as Marcel Duchamp, but signing it as Armat. So he wanted to say that it's not the individuality of the artist that decides the work of the art either, that decides the character and the quality and ultimately fate of this subject. So he wanted to move against something that was a nascent and very important part of the art world back in the day. And this was the development of the idea that within art, we are very much interested in the personality of an artist. So this is something that was very fresh and arguably in its infant stages. This whole idea that when we contemplate what is art and what is not, we want to seek personal qualities, individual qualities in the work of art. So you could say that it was with Van Gogh, proto-expressionist, post-impressionist painter, that we had this displacement of the field of art from the field of skill and technical capacity and indeed physical beauty to the field of depth of soul, personal drama, mental illness when it comes to Van Gogh. So he basically displaced art from the domain of skill and technical perfection towards the domain of what is personal, what is individual, what deals with the soul of the artist. And Duchamp says it's not about that either. So we don't care about the individuality of the artist. We don't care about their struggles. We don't care about their pain. None of this matters. The only thing that matters is how the society accepts this object. And he goes quite far in stating that even the most lowly, banal, and downright offensive object can become a work of art. So history of the 20th century, history of art, claims that Marcel Duchamp actually had a point, that he was right to state this, because this is one of the most important works of art of the 20th century. So we have this, I would say, general consensus from art historians that this is the most important work of art of the 20th century. And I'll let you decide if that makes sense or not. The point is that this particular gesture, presenting this urinal that was again not created but was appropriated, was to state that the entire world of art makes no sense, that it was looking in a completely wrong direction for all this time, these thousands of years that we've been dealing with the notion of art. So the whole time this was not art, the completely different thing is. And so what Marcel Duchamp is doing by this gesture, by this act, is that he is again displacing the field of art towards a completely different territory, towards the completely different terrain, if you will. So he is displacing the field of art towards something that doesn't have anything to do with matter as such. And this is a very medieval and a very Christian take on things. I would argue, again, Orthodox Christian take on things, that we want to take the domain of art from the realm of matter and we want to put it in the realm of spirit. Now, when we say this, the realm of spirit, it has a lot to do not with the realm of spirit, as is the case with abstract art, and this is the next topic that we're going to be addressing in the sequent lecture, but really the realm of spirit as it exists within a community. So the notion of community is the most important here, because, again, Duchamp argues that it's the community that decides if an object is a work of art or not. It's not the artist. The artist can do pretty much whatever. They can just take a urinal and say, look, this is your art now. It's really if the community accepts this that makes all the difference. You can have the most beautiful, complex, layered, profound, emotionally engaging painting or statue or which have you ever made. If the community doesn't recognize it as such, it will fall into oblivion. No one will care about it. And we've had these examples in history of art that phenomenal pieces were made and then lost and then rediscovered. So these things happened, and they happen all the time. We have revisionist history of art, where we understand that a certain work of art was not that good, or it was actually amazing, but we were unaware of it for centuries. So these things happen all the time, and it really, the only thing that matters is if we agree as a community that something is art or not. And this truly takes us back again to this medieval idea again of the church rather than anything else. And why do I say the church? Well, because we have this whole idea of ecclesia, and ecclesia, as we know in the West, is considered the church, but in the East as well. Ecclesia in its original term means a gathering, a political gathering. This is when the community comes together to decide whatever needs to be decided in the life of a community. So it's this idea that when you're looking at churches, of how they're made, I'm talking about physical buildings of churches, they are made for congregation. They are made for people to come inside and partake in the act of worship together. So it's this idea of togetherness that truly defines the church. And it's this idea that whenever people come together, they create things. In this particular case, they partake in worship. So it's also what Christ has said, that every time when there's more than one person, he is with them. So wherever there's a community and they think about Christ, that's where Christ is, that's where God is. So this is to say that something that is completely opposed to the Protestant spirit, that you cannot have a relationship with God alone. You have to have your community. You only exist through your community in this particular religious manner. So Marcel Duchamp is stating this in his own way by negating, quite obviously, and ridiculizing even, this notion of artistic individuality. So what you can say is that he's going directly against the heritage of the Renaissance, the heritage of neoclassicism, and truly this idea that it's the individuality of an artist that matters something. So you could say that most of the idea of an artist and the idea of art that we practice more or less to this day, but certainly before Duchamp came along, was the idea that was presented to us by Giorgio Vasari, a very well-known and very influential painter and writer, art historian, arguably the first art historian in the modern understanding of the term, from the 16th century. So it was really from Giorgio Vasari's work, Lives and Works of Famous Painters, I think that's the title, where he presented this idea of a painter and a sculptor as this special, inspired, educated, skillful individual that creates art. And so you could argue that this is very much responsible for how we see art to this day, or at least how we saw it up until the beginning of the 20th century and up until the beginning of the Dada movement. So we have this whole idea of individuality of the artist being very important, and the skill that is integrated, that permeates this individuality. So this notion that when you create a work of art, you have to train yourself to become a very, very precise instrument, essentially, and this forms your persona, this shapes your soul, and so this is what creates art. None of it has to do, none of this has anything to do with art. Marcel Duchamp argues the name that is a signature is false, so it can be anyone, it can be a completely made-up individual, like Armat is in this particular case. It doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is the community. So if the community agrees that this is a work of art, it can literally be a human excrement, which is another thing that Dadaists and then later artists have dealt with, presenting human excrement as a work of art. It can be a work of art. And it really was. It was accepted as such. So you could argue that at least up until now, Marcel Duchamp had a point, because he is seen as one of the most important voices of the 20th century and one of the most important influences on the art of the 20th century. Now again, if you are a right-wing conservative art historian, you can say that this is the absolute decadence. Yes, this is absolute nihilism, and this is opposed to the spirit of art as it is. But then again, you can say, yes, it is opposed to the spirit of the art as it was seen from Renaissance onwards, and as it was seen invested in the material world, art that we see as beauty, material beauty, the beauty that has to do with skill, with your hands, with production of things. It is very much nihilistic in this context, but it's not nihilistic per se in general, because it proposes a completely different form of art, the form of art that has to do with life of the community, communal life, You can argue that the very idea of communism in this particular regard, because we are in the beginning of the 20th century and we have the Bolshevik Revolution on its way, we have this particular ideology shaping the century truly. So it is very, very close to this. It is very close to this idea of the communal life. It's the community that makes all the important decisions, not the individual artist or the individual thinker or anything else. And so you could argue that the whole of Dada really is about this carnivalesque distortion and rather upheaval and again revolution of the society as it is. It's about turning everything upside down because, again, arguably, this is what you need to do, in words of Jesus Christ, if you want divine logic to be enacted, if you want divine society to come together, you have to abandon this human, materialistic logic that we were using thus far and that got us to this predicament to begin with. So we need to understand this and we need to talk about this. We need to think about this as very revolutionary. Now, the reason why we connect Dada to communism and to the eastern part of the world, which had the first successful communist revolution happen, the Bolshevik Revolution, is also because Dada doesn't really have a clear aesthetic. So this is the movement that doesn't have immediate recognition, visual recognition, as is the case with Renaissance or Baroque or classical Greek style or Hellenism. So this is not a movement when you can see a painting or let's say Impressionism and say, oh yeah, this is Impressionist beyond a doubt. No, Dada doesn't have this type of visual identity, and it makes perfect sense that it doesn't, because not only that it's all about performance and objects, it's all about this idea that we need to transcend visuals. We need to transcend the material world as such. So we create objects that seemingly make no sense, that are to tell us about superior logic. And you can say that this whole notion of superior logic, logic that leaves this plane of existence, has a lot to do with its zeitgeist. It has a lot to do with the first half of the 20th century. Because this is what abstract artists are trying to achieve in their own end. This is what surrealists are trying to achieve. In their particular case, we're really talking about it being present in the very name of the movement. Surréalisme in French means above realism. So it's a movement that deals with something that is above reality. And you could argue that Dada does the same thing. So it's this whole idea that the only connection, a visual connection that we can make between Dadaism and something that is immediately more or less recognizable is machine aesthetics. So this idea that artists were very much interested in functioning and appearance of machines. And this, of course, clearly has to do with the industrial nature of the movement. And it also has to do with how left-wing people, how Marxists explain the possibility of communism through the industrial process. So this is why we say that Christ, seen from this particular point of view, is a proto-communist, but not a full communist, because he exists in time that is before the Industrial Revolution. So you could say that Dadaists were interested in industry as a capacity of achieving a different world. But if we want to achieve a different world, if we want to make a better world, we have to not only refuse, but downright oppose and ridicule and parodize and satirize the logic of this world. And this is what their movement is all about. And this has, again, very, very much to do with the medieval notion of the carnival, with the medieval logic that is superior in question. So it's not the logic of this world, it is the logic of the world above it. And we go back to the words of Christ: if you want to be the first, you have to be last. And you can understand how this has a very important class distinction. So a lot can be said about it, but I think we've already covered it enough. We have went beyond 1 hour, so we shall end it here. And I hope this was interesting. I hope to have some comments on this video to see if you agreed or disagreed with it. Is this how you see Dada, or you see it in a different manner? I'm looking forward to reading all of this, and I'm looking forward to having you again soon. So, ciao.